If you manage a team, you know how incredible it can feel when you hire an A player. But we also need to take responsibility when things don't go to plan. Most agency owners don't lose out because of bad clients or bad work. They lose because of bad hires. And the real cost of a bad hire isn't just the salary. It's the time, the morale, the clients affected, and the months that you spend cleaning up the mess. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 5 most costly hiring mistakes that creative agency owners make, and most importantly, how you can go about fixing them. So the first mistake is hiring too quickly in order to fill the role. So desperation drives bad decisions. And there's so many instances where we end up hiring the wrong fit or the wrong skills or the wrong values because we are rushing. And that happens over and over and over again. And the reality is that we end up being back to square one, not now, but when we end up getting into the place where we have a mess in order to clean up. So the reality is that we actually need to slow the process down. And it's incredibly important that we make sure that we are very pragmatic about how we go about hiring. We need to be thinking about things far enough in advance so that we have a pool of candidates that allow for us to be sure that we are hiring the right person. So we need to be evaluating based on the true culture of the agency. We need to make sure that we have a clear understanding that they can do the actual role. But here's one of the most important factors that I see that will make the most meaningful difference is having them do a real-world task. So you can have a freelancer or a team member to be able to bridge this gap that you have while you're going through this process to make sure that you're hiring a true A player. But here's the thing, is that in this task, you want to be able to evaluate for not only the ability to do the job, but you want to be able to evaluate for the thinking. So there's tests within the actual task that you're going to put in front of them. So as an example, if you have a strategist, you are going to put some things in front of them that allow for them to make the appropriate action. So maybe you have a link to a call that was with a client, or a brief that's going to give you the insight, or an ability for them to actually go and actually do some research. Depending on the amount of time that is going to take them to complete this, you may need to compensate them for this, but that it's so much cheaper to pay for multiple candidates to go through this specific test or task before actually hiring the wrong person, because the hiring of the wrong person is incredibly more expensive. Number 2 is failing to see behind the mask. So the reality is that when you're going about hiring, you're actually seeing the absolute best version of this person. And your job is to find the real person behind this mask and making sure that you're very clear. And so they're, again, like I said, they are the best version of themselves in this interview process. So if there's any red flags, if there's any issues, this is your moment to back away and ultimately continue your search. So you do need to go through the tough questions. You need to go through them more than once. You need to make sure that you're going about having an incredible amount of detail. So the reality is especially for senior level team members, is that when you are asked about a specific client scope of work or something that you've done, you're able to go into detail in the most infinitesimal version of it. And you need to be able to have your team members do the same thing. They need to be able to explain these items, allowing for you to be able to understand the level of detail that they are going to actually understand what it is that you're asking for and how they're going to actually go about this in practice. And one of the things that I do find really important is being able to get this conversation into what feels a bit more casual. And so the reality is that interviews can feel quite taxing for the candidate as well. So making sure that you bring them into what can feel a bit more like a casual setting. So you may start with something small, understanding a little bit about them, that sort of thing that allows for them to feel a little bit more comfortable in making sure that you have this understanding. The piece that I want you to really understand here is you are going to need to do a couple of things to make sure that you're not doing this in the wrong fashion. So the first is you do want to make sure that you call references. You do want to make sure that you ask that reference about their character, not just about their performance, about who they are as a person. How do they interact with other team members? How do they interact with clients? How do they manage things under pressure? And how do they go about solving for these specific components that will come out inevitably in their role? And so making sure that you understand these facets of that candidate is incredibly important. Number 3 is misaligned expectation. So this is one that I see come up a load, and it's very fraught in the industry, is that we end up having ambiguity for new hires and they don't end up having the understanding of what they need in order for them to be able to be successful. And so good people do not stay where they feel lost or they feel confused, where they don't know how to be successful in the role. So you need to have really meaningfully defined roles, responsibilities, and ultimately exactly what success looks like. I think it's vital that you actually have some non-negotiables around this role and exactly black or white, whether this specific item was met, A players want to succeed in their role. They want to actually not only just achieve what is necessary, but they want to go above and beyond. So it's vital that they understand what that looks like and that they're meaningfully able to actually put that into practice. What you need to do in order to be able to allow for this to happen is that you should have 30, 60, 90-day milestones throughout the actual onboarding process. Allow for them to understand exactly what it looks like to be successful in this role, get them to agree, get them to be able to reiterate what exactly these expectations are so that they can turn it into meaningful commitment, allowing for them to be the best versions of themselves at your agency. Number 4 is failing to communicate the company culture. So you should be interviewing, first off, interviewing by company culture, but bluntly, skills does not actually mean a culture fit. So you can have an absolute great execution person on the team, but ultimately, if there's misalignment in culture, it actually creates an incredible amount of friction in client engagement, in internal collaboration, and it ends up killing morale, and it hurts the output of not only this person, but of every single person that they interact with. And so this cannot be overstated. This is an incredibly important component of hiring a really meaningfully impactful player, is actually having them have a great culture fit. So you need to communicate culture early. You need to be interviewing them based on culture and actually having a reasonable set of questions that are being asked for every single person and making sure that you're onboarding and reaffirming the culture of the agency. And so here's something that's really important is that I largely believe that you should have clarity around what your culture is and what your values are, and you should be interviewing based on those. And that every single person should go through these stages is, generally speaking, you have a culture interview. That's the first interview to just make sure before they actually get to hiring manager. And then you have hiring manager going through interviewing this person. You then have a task that they are going to go about. And then you have the final interview where I generally recommend that the job offer is made. But you're going to go through these interviews to ensure that this person actually hits all of the qualifications, not only in the individual contributor components, but also in culture. And then finally, 5, which is one of the biggest gaps that I see happening, is hiring without meaningful documentation. So it actually ends up creating a load of chaos from day one. And the reality is that every single person comes into your agency and then they end up having a perception around who you are. And if they feel lost, they're unsure, they feel like they can't do a good job, it actually creates a whole lot of tension for this specific person. And so the existing team is going to be continually interrupted, so they don't end up having a good experience with this new person. And it ends up creating a dynamic where someone is going to want to leave because they are struggling either interacting with new hires, your existing team members, and so they end up leaving because they are struggling onboarding new people. And so they end up feeling taxed by that while they're still having to do their individual roles. Or you end up having this A player that comes in unsure about how to go about actually integrating into your agency, and then they end up leaving for the same reason. So you should be documenting how things go about being done, your workflows, your onboarding, your SOPs of exactly what it means and what it means to be complete and the work that they're ultimately doing. And so every hire should get the same information so that they can hit the ground running faster, better. But throughout that onboarding process, you now have the ability to be able to provide them with the collateral, the knowledge, the information that they need in order to be successful. The reality is that you have a really meaningful force multiplier. So you can either be 100% behind an employee or you're not. And that moment that trust wavers, you subconsciously start to just pull support. And so you need to either be fully behind your team, really understanding where they are. So no matter where they are, you're able to actually meet them appropriately, being able to trust them, provide them the full support, and set them up so that they're more successful. But if you don't do that and you start to pull support, they are set up to fail. So you need to be able to go all in, give them the tools, the guidance, the knowledge, the support, the mentorship, so that they have every single chance to succeed. But the moment that that trust wavers, you need to make a change and not have that person continue. Every bad hire doesn't just cost you money. It costs you standards, it costs you morale, and time that you're just never going to get back. But hiring the right people is only half of the equation. Once they're in, how you manage them based on their capacity and commitment is what determines whether your team performs meaningfully or they're going to plateau. So watch this next video on how high-performing creative teams are actually built.